London in January of that year was a city of closed doors. The cold had descended from the north in the first week and had not relented since. The river had frozen at its edges, and the smoke from 100,000 hearths hung low over the streets like a lid on a pot. Behind every elegant door in every fashionable square, fires burned brightly, lamps glowed, and the world within was warm. The doors themselves remained shut. That was the way of a great city in a harsh winter. It was brimming with warmth, yet none of it was for the person on the wrong side of the door. The doors of respectable houses were the most formidable of all. They were painted a glossy black, their brass knockers polished before dawn. When they did open, it was to reveal a wall of heat, candlelight, and the low hum of voices belonging to people who had never worried about where they would sleep. They did not open often. A grand house learned to gauge a visitor's worth by the slump of their shoulders, the wear on their boots. They knew precisely who was worth the trouble of letting the heat escape. And they had all learned that the young woman going door to door that fortnight was not worth it at all. Her name was the trouble. She had learned to utter it last, as a final resort, because the moment it was spoken, the door would begin to close. Henrietta Wendwood was 24 years old. Until 2 years prior, she had been a gentleman's daughter. Now, she was nothing. She stood on the servants' steps of the last house on her list, a respectable establishment in a fine square, and waited while the housekeeper reread her letter of application. She kept her back straight. She had learned that in 2 years. You kept your back straight, and you did not let them see you were cold. You did not beg. The only thing left to a woman who had lost everything else was the dignity with which she lost it. "Wendwood," said the housekeeper, looking up. Henrietta watched her name do its work. It was a subtle thing, the flicker of change on a face, a tightening, a drawing back, as if from something contagious. The housekeeper had been almost cordial a moment before. The letter was well written, the hand that penned it that of a lady. Now, she folded it along its creases and held it out through the gap in the door, as though returning something she was reluctant to have touched. "We have filled the position," she said. "You advertised it this morning. We have filled it since." The door was closing. "I would not trouble the other houses, if I were you, Miss Wendwood. Word travels. There is no situation in London for that name, and there will not be. Try a manufacturing town where they do not know it. Good day." The door shut. The brass lion knocker looked down impassively, and Henrietta Wendwood stood on the cold steps in the fading afternoon, understanding at last and completely that the housekeeper was right. She had known it for a fortnight and refused to acknowledge it. Now, she knew it. Every respectable house in London had refused her, one after another. Some had been kind, most had not. The reason was always the same, and the reason would never change, because the thing that had ruined her father was not something that faded. It was written down. It was in the record of a court. It had been in the newspapers for a whole cold spring in the largest type they possessed, and everyone who mattered had read it. No amount of good character in the daughter could unwrite a single line of it. Her father had been Mr. Wendwood, a gentleman of Hertfordshire, a man of no great fortune but considerable exactness. He had managed the accounts of a great charitable trust for 20 years without an error or a farthing gone astray. And then, a great sum went astray. The paper that showed where it had gone was in Mr. Wendwood's hand, or in a hand so like his, that 3 men swore to it in a courtroom. There had been no one to swear otherwise who mattered. Mr. Wendwood was ruined in a week and dead within the year of nothing the physicians could name, which is to say, of shame. Henrietta had been 22. She had stood in the courtroom. She had heard her father say, in a voice she did not recognize, that he had not done it, that he had never in his life touched a farthing that was not his, that some other hand had written that paper and let his name carry it. She had believed him. She still believed him. It made not the smallest difference to a single door in London. A daughter's belief was not evidence. It was not even interesting. The fortnight had taught her precisely how it would go, and it had gone that way every time. In the first days, she had tried the registry offices, where gentlewomen sought gentle places. The clerks were brisk until the name, and then cold. Then she had tried the houses directly, with her good letter and her straight back. Some turned her away at the servants' steps. One had led her as far as the hall. A lady had come down and looked at her the way one looks at a stain. She said only, "Wendwood," and Henrietta turned and went back up. Henrietta had had a little money at the start of the fortnight. She had almost none at the end of it. She had sold her mother's brooch in the second week to a man who knew exactly how little she could afford to refuse him. She had 1 meal a day now. She had learned to make it last. She had learned, too, that hunger, past a certain point, is quieter than people think. It does not roar. It only makes the cold colder, the doors taller, and the counting harder to hold on to. So she stood on the steps in the cold and she counted. Counting was the trick that had kept her upright at the worst times. She reached 3. Then she picked up her small valise, which held everything she owned in the world, and went back up into the square. She had until the light failed to decide whether she had the courage to be a governess in a town where no one knew her name, or whether she had run out of courage entirely, at last. It was there in the square that the carriage found her. She heard it before she saw it, the distinctive sound of a heavy carriage on frozen cobbles, and she stepped aside without looking, as a person on foot learns to do. It did not pass her. It slowed. It stopped. A footman in plain dark livery got down and came to her and asked, with great correctness and no curiosity at all, whether he had the honor of addressing Miss Wendwood. She said that he did. She could not imagine why he should want to. The footman held out a letter. It was a single sheet, folded once, sealed with a plain seal. Her name on the outside, in a spare, upright hand. She did not know. She opened it there in the cold, her fingers clumsy, expecting, she did not know what, a demand, a cruelty, some last account come due. It was 3 lines. You are offered the post of companion to my aunt, Lady Perseus, at Old Croft in Kent. The wages are £40 the year. The carriage will take you now. There was no signature. There was instead, at the foot of the sheet, a single letter written larger than the rest. The way a man signs a thing, he signs a great deal. Henrietta read it twice. Then she looked at the footman, who looked back with the perfect blankness of a well-trained servant, and she asked the only question that mattered. Whose carriage is this? His Grace's, miss. His Grace of what? Linwood, miss. And Henrietta Wendwood, who had thought there was nothing left in the world to frighten her, felt the cold go a little deeper, for she knew that name too. Everyone knew that name. The Duke of Linwood was the man they whispered about behind their hands in the very drawing rooms that had shut their doors on her. The Duke of Linwood was the Duke who never spoke. There were a great many stories about why. Some said he was mad, quietly and dangerously mad, and that his family hid it behind his silence. Some said he had killed a man in his youth, in a duel, or worse, and had never spoken freely since, for fear of what his own tongue might let out. Some said he was simply the proudest man in England, too proud to waste words on a world he despised. These were the ones who hated him most. There is nothing society forgives less than being despised in silence. What all of them agreed on was the fact of it. The Duke of Linwood did not make speeches. He did not make conversation. He did not explain himself. He had not, within living memory, been heard to say more than a dozen words together in a public room. He sat at the head of great tables and said nothing. He came to the House and voted, and did not rise. He gave, it was said, enormous sums to this cause and that, always in silence, always without his name, so that the giving could never be traced and never be thanked. The silence had only deepened over the years, until it stopped being a habit and became the whole of what people knew of him, the Duke who never spoke. It was not a name a wise woman would trust. Henrietta looked at the 3 lines in her hand, and the single letter L and the warm dark carriage waiting. She thought of the manufacturing town. She thought of the cold. She thought of the last of her courage. Why? She said aloud to no one. To the footman. To the letter. Why would he offer me anything? He does not know me. No one who knows my name offers me anything but the far side of a door. The footman had no answer. It was not his place to have one. He stood in the cold and waited. The horses stamped. The light failed over the square. And Henrietta Wendwood made the choice a person makes when there is really no choice left. She got into the carriage. It was warm inside. Warmer than anywhere she had been in a fortnight. There was a rug folded on the seat. She wrapped herself in it and hated herself a little for how good it was. And the carriage carried her out of London into the dark, toward a house she had never seen, and a man who did not speak, and a reason she could not begin to guess. Old Croft, when she came to it 2 days later, was not the house she had braced herself for. She had expected something grim. A silent man, she had reasoned, would live in a silent house, cold and shut and forbidding, all long corridors and covered furniture. Old Croft was not that. It was a long, low, old house of grey Kentish stone, grown out of its hill over 300 years without any particular plan. It looked warm even in the January dusk, its windows lit gold, smoke going up straight from a dozen chimneys into the still cold air. It looked, she thought, getting down stiff and frightened in the courtyard, like a house that was lived in and loved. That was the last thing she had expected of it, and it unsettled her more than grimness would have. Grimness she could have understood. She was taken in by a housekeeper with a kind, worried face, Mrs. Ashby, who bobbed and clucked and took the frozen valises from her hands as though they were something of value. She was given a room. The room had a fire already lit in it, burning well, as though it had been lit an hour before and tended since. "Was I expected so exactly?" Henrietta asked. "The fire is Grace's order, miss," said Mrs. Ashby, and something crossed the kind face, some private wondering of her own. "He came down himself this morning to see the great draught proper. He does not often come to the guest rooms. I could not tell you why he took the trouble. He does not tell anyone why he takes any trouble, but he took it." She twitched the curtains straight and went to the door. "You'll be wanting to be warm. Sit close. Nobody stands on ceremony at Old Croft, for there is no one here to stand on it with." She went out, and Henrietta stood in front of the fire, and could not for a moment make sense of it. In 2 years, no one had lit a fire for her before she asked. She had forgotten there were places where such a thing was simply done. She held her cold hands to the flames and told herself it meant nothing, that a great house lit a great many fires. But a duke had come down himself to see that this one drew, and she did not know what to do with that at all. She met Lady Perseus that evening, and Lady Perseus, at least, made sense. The duke's aunt was a small, upright woman of nearly 80, with a sharp, lined face and bright black eyes that missed nothing. She made up in words for every word her nephew failed to say. She talked. She talked from the moment Henrietta came into the room, a dry, running commentary on everything and everyone. It took Henrietta some time to understand that the talk was a kindness. The old woman had seen her fright and was covering it. She was giving her time, asking nothing of her but that she sit by the fire and let the words wash over her until she stopped shaking. "You are wondering," said Lady Perseus at last, when the tea had been poured, "why you are here. Of course you are. Any woman with sense would be. I will tell you the part I can tell, which is my part. The rest you must have from my nephew, if you can get it, which I doubt. Getting anything out of Samuel is like getting water from a stone, and I have been trying for 32 years. She set down her cup. "I am old and difficult, and I have driven off 4 companions in 3 years, the last of them in tears, which I am not proud of. My nephew is tired of the trouble of replacing them. He proposed you, that is the whole of my part. Whether you will suit me, I have no idea, and whether I will suit you, I have less. But you are here, and it is winter, and neither of us has anywhere better to be. We may as well try." "Why me?" said Henrietta. "Your nephew does not know me. And my name?" She stopped. She had learned to stop before the name. "You must know my name, Lady Perseus. Everyone knows my name." The old woman looked at her a long moment with her bright black eyes. "I know your name," she said. "Wendwood? Yes, I knew it when he proposed you." And she said nothing more about it, which was its own kind of answer. She turned the talk to other things, and Henrietta understood that she had come up against the edge of the part Lady Perseus could tell. The rest lay somewhere in the silence of a man she had not yet properly seen. She saw him the next morning. She had risen early, being unable to sleep in so strange a bed, and had gone down in the grey first light to find the library. She had been told she might use it, and the promise of a room full of books had been the one warm thought in a cold night. She found it. It was a beautiful room, high and long, with a gallery. There were more books than she had seen since her father's small, good collection was sold at the door of their old house to pay men her father had never owed. She stood in it and felt something in her chest ease that had been tight for 2 years. Then she turned, and the Duke of Linwood was standing in the doorway watching her. She had not heard him come. He moved, she would learn, as quietly as he spoke. He was tall and dark, with dark hair going gray too early at the temples, and a hard, still face that gave away nothing. His eyes were a strange, clear storm gray, and they rested on her with an attention so complete and so silent that she felt it like a hand laid on her. She had braced all this while for what such a man might want of a woman he had taken in off the street. Meeting those gray eyes, She saw at once that she had braced for the wrong thing entirely. There was no want in them of the kind she had feared. There was something else, something that looked impossibly like a debt. "Your Grace," she said, and curtsied, and did not know what else to do. He inclined his head. He did not speak. He looked at her a moment longer, and she had the strangest sense that he was reading her the way she read a page, taking in the whole of her, the mended gown, the straight back, the 2 years written in her face, and setting it all down somewhere careful. Then he crossed to a table. He took up a card that lay ready there. He wrote on it briefly in the spare, upright hand she knew from the letter. He left it on the table and went out, all without a word. She went to the table when he had gone. The card said, "The library is yours whenever you wish it. Take any book you like. No one will disturb you here at this hour but me, and I will not." She stood holding it, this small courtesy in a dead man's stone of a house, written because the man who meant it would not or could not say it aloud. And Henrietta Wendwood, who had not wept in 2 years, who had trained herself out of weeping as a thing that cost too much, felt her eyes sting, and did not understand it at all. She had come to Old Croft, braced for a price. She spent her first weeks there, waiting for the price to be named. Everything in her experience of the 2 years past told her that nothing was given without one, that the giving which seemed kindest were the ones whose price came dearest in the end. She watched the Duke for it. She watched for the moment his silence would turn, for the demand behind the courtesy, for the catch in the warm room and the lit fire, and the library that was hers whenever she wished it. The catch did not come. That was the thing she could not fit into any shape she knew. Week followed week. The Duke said nothing and asked nothing, and the price was never named because there was no price. She began slowly, against every instinct, to believe it, and believing it frightened her more than a price would have, for a price she understood, and this she did not. She came to know the house and the shape of the days in it, and by the shape of the days she began, without meaning to know the man. He was not idle. That was the first thing she learned, and it surprised her, for she had imagined a silent Duke as a man who did nothing but brood. Samuel of Linwood worked quietly and constantly at the running of a great estate, and a great deal else besides. He did it almost entirely on paper, in the spare, upright hand, from a study whose door was usually open, and whose silence was never empty. Letters went out from Old Croft by the dozen. Money went with them, and Henrietta, who kept Lady Perce's company through the long days, and had the run of the house, began to see in glimpses where the money went. She saw the first of it by accident, on a raw morning in her 3rd week. She had walked out to the home farm on an errand of the old lady's. There was a commotion by the barn, a young stable hand, a boy of 14, white and shaking, a bolting horse checked at last by 2 men, a smashed rail. The boy had been careless. Everyone knew it. The head groom was working himself up to a rage that would have ended in a dismissal, and a dismissed farm boy without a character was a boy who did not eat. And the Duke was there. He must have heard the commotion from the yard. He came into the barn silent, and everyone fell quiet, waiting for the master's judgment, which everyone assumed would be hard, for the master was a hard man. He did not speak. He looked at the boy a long moment with the gray eyes. He looked at the smashed rail. Then he took the boy by the shoulder, not roughly, and turned him. He put the shaking boy's hand flat on the horse's neck and held it there. He held it until the horse quieted, and the boy quieted with it. He held it there a long time, and then he wrote something on a card and gave it to the head groom and went out. Henrietta was near enough to see the groom's face change as he read it. She learned later from Mrs. Ashe what it said. It said that the boy was to be kept and taught properly by the groom himself, and that if the boy was ever dismissed for a fault, the groom had failed to teach out of him. It was the groom who would answer for it. No one was scolded, no one was shamed. A careless boy was simply, wordlessly saved, and set to be made better, and the whole of it was done without a spoken word. She came upon it again and again after that, once she had learned to see it. Money went to a tenant whose barn had burned, whose rent was quietly forgiven for 2 years, who never learned from whom. It went to the widow of a man who had worked at Old Croft and drowned. A pension was arranged through a lawyer, so that it seemed to come from a fund and not from a person, so that the widow need never feel the weight of a duke's private charity. It went to a boy of the village, clever and poor, sent to a good school with his fees paid by a hand he would never know. She met the burned-out tenant herself once. He was an old man named Corby, and she came on him when she walked to the village on the old lady's errands. He spoke of it to her, not knowing who she was or where she lodged, the way country people speak of a wonder. His barn had gone up in a dry August, he said, and with it his year. He had lain awake a week, waiting for the agent to come and turn him off, for he was 2 quarters behind, and knew the law. The agent had come, but the agent had brought a paper that forgave the 2 quarters, and 2 years more besides, and never a word of who had ordered it. Some fund, the old man said, and shook his head. They said a fund, but there's no fund walks the fields at dawn to see as a man's new barn framed square. And I've seen him do it, miss. The tall dark one that never says aught, walking my field before light, looking at my roof tree, and gone before I could get my boots on to thank him. A fund. He laughed and wiped his eyes, not ashamed of it. I'll tell you what I think. I think there's a man hereabouts does more good than any 10 that preach it, and has took some hurt that keeps him from letting on. I put him in my prayers by no name at all, for I have none to give him. I reckon the Almighty knows the one I mean. Henrietta walked home with that in her, and it did not leave her. She had come to Old Croft believing she was the only soul in the county who owed the silent Duke a debt she could not name. She saw now that she was one of a great many. They were scattered through the fields, the cottages, the village lanes. A whole quiet company of people saved by a hand none of them could thank. They put a nameless man in their prayers, and did not know he had a name at all. It was a strange thing to be one of a company you had thought yourself alone in. It was a warm thing, too, on a cold walk home. Again and again she came upon the same pattern, the same care taken, that the giving should never be traced, never be thanked, never put the one who received it under the burden of gratitude to her face. She asked Lady Perseus about it once. The old woman was quiet a while. "He does not like to be thanked," she said at last. "It is not modesty. I want you to understand that, for you will be tempted to think it modesty, and it is not. It is something harder. He does not believe that his thanks are worth having, nor his word, nor anything of his that is only said. So he gives things that are real. Money is real, a roof is real, a place at a school is real. These are things a man can do without opening his mouth. And my nephew has come to trust only the things a man can do without opening his mouth." She looked at Henrietta with her bright old eyes. "He was not always so. That is the part you do not know, and I will not tell you, for it is his to tell, but he was not always so. Once he was the most open-hearted boy you ever saw. He talked. My heavens, how he talked. And he believed that if you only told people the truth, they would hear it. Something cured him of that. I was there when it happened. I have watched him pay for it every day for 10 years, and I would give the rest of my life to undo it, and I cannot, because the only person who can undo it is him, and he will not. He has stopped believing there is any use in trying." Henrietta carried that with her for a long time. She began after it to watch the Duke differently, not for the price any longer, for the wound. And slowly, in the way of a house shared through a long winter, they came to know each other, the silent man and the ruined girl, though not one word of the coming to know was spoken by him aloud. It was in the library, during those hushed, pre-dawn hours that belonged only to them, that it all began. Initially, she'd intended to keep out of his way, but he'd left a card declaring the room hers, and to her surprise, he didn't seem to mind her presence at all. If anything, he seemed to seek it, arriving at his usual time to find her already there, settling into his own reading a little distance away. They existed in a shared silence, 2 figures in the gathering light. It should have been awkward, but it wasn't. She'd never felt so at ease in silence before. Their conversations began in a peculiar fashion. She would speak, and he would write. She'd comment on the book in her hands, perhaps an argument she disagreed with or a passage that struck her. He would listen with that intense, unwavering gray gaze. After a pause, he'd jot down a line on a card and pass it to her. His replies were concise, precise, and often laced with an unexpected wit. She'd respond aloud, and he'd write again. She memorized one of their earliest exchanges. She'd been reading a weighty tome on the duties of the great. Half to herself, she'd murmured that the author had clearly never held any real greatness in his life, or he'd know that duty is far easier to write about than to practice. The Duke had written a card and slid it over. He was a bishop, it read. They are great in the one way that costs nothing. She'd laughed, the first genuine laugh she'd uttered in that house, and declared it unkind, and probably true, and asked if he ever thought well of anyone. He'd written back, "Seldom. It saves disappointment." Then, after a moment, a second card, which he seemed to consider before handing it to her. "I make exceptions. They are more trouble than the rule, but I am told they are worth it." He hadn't looked at her as she read it. His gaze was fixed on the fire, while Henrietta looked at the card, unable to voice her reply. Instead, she quietly slipped it into her pocket, not returning it to the table. It was the strangest conversation of her life, half-spoken and half-written, conducted at the deliberate pace of a man who weighed each word before committing it to ink. And, she came to realize, it was the truest conversation of her life. A man who must write something down doesn't do so lightly. Everything Samuel of Linwood wrote to her on those cards was considered honest and meaningful. That same week, a visitor arrived at Oldcroft, Mrs. Falkland, a local lady who paid Lady Perseus a dutiful call twice a year, lingered far too long, and possessed an uncanny knowledge of everyone's affairs. She eyed Henrietta with undisguised curiosity, offered polite platitudes, and expertly steered the conversation over tea towards her true purpose. "Of course," she said, her tone laced with feigned sympathy. "They do say the Duke is not quite himself." She tapped her temple and smiled. "One hears such things. The silence, you know. It's not natural in a man. My husband says a man who won't speak has something he dares not say." Henrietta set down her teacup. She hadn't intended to speak, but the words tumbled out. "Your husband is mistaken," she said. "I have lived under this roof for 3 months. I have witnessed a reckless boy kept from ruin, a burned-out tenant restored to his farm, a drowned man's widow saved from the workhouse, all by a hand that took the greatest care never to be seen or thanked. That is not a man with something he dares not say. That is a man who has decided that speaking is cheap and doing is dear, and has chosen the dearer path. I wish there were more like him, and fewer who tap their temples over their tea." A silence fell. Mrs. Follen's smile tightened. Across the room, Lady Perseus emitted a small sound into her needlework, perhaps a cough, perhaps not. And Henrietta, her heart pounding, understood 2 things simultaneously. She had been unforgivably rude to a guest, and she meant every word she'd said, and would say them again. She had spoken for the silent Duke, just as 10 years prior, the silent Duke had once spoken for her father into a room that didn't want to hear it. She didn't know then that he'd heard about it. He heard about everything at Oldcroft. That evening, a card lay on the library table, bearing his distinct, upright script. It read simply, "Mrs. Falkland is not worth the powder, but I thank you for it." It was the first time he had ever written her the word thank. She kept that card too. That winter, he watched her more than she knew, and thought more than he wrote. He had planned it all in silence, as he planned everything. Find the daughter, take her in, do in deeds what he had failed to do in words, ensure her safety, her comfort, and when the proof was ready, and the moment right, see her father's name restored. It had been a clean plan, a debt with a tangible form, something he could settle and be done with. He had not planned for that second morning in the library. He had not planned for a woman who told him he was wrong about a book, and was right, and did not soften her critique because he was a duke. He had not planned for the way the house felt different with her in it, for the way he found himself drawn to the library at that gray hour, seeking the company of a silence that, for the first time in 10 years, was not empty. There were moments he longed to speak. That was the danger she posed. For 10 years, he had gone without that desire. Now, there were moments, watching her frown over a page, when words surged within him like water behind a dam, and he had to set them down in ink, or not at all. He distrusted the wanting. He had wanted to speak once before, at 22, with his whole heart, and the world had taught him the worth of his words. So he wrote his cards and maintained his wall, telling himself it was enough. And he knew, in the part of a man that tells no lies in the quiet hours, that it was not enough, that it hadn't been enough for some time, that the wall was going to crumble, whether he willed it or no. He just didn't know yet what would bring it down. She kept the cards. At first she couldn't have said why. She stored them in her dressing table drawer, a small, growing stack of them, his spare, upright script on good, plain cardstock. She told herself it was simply that they were the closest thing she had to conversation, but it was more than that. And she knew it was more than that, and that knowing frightened her in the old way, the way the lit fire had frightened her, the way the unlooked-for kindness had frightened her, because it meant she was beginning to want something again. and she had learned 2 years prior what came of wanting. It was Lady Perseus in the end who told her why she was at Oldcroft, or at least the beginning of it, the thread that led to the rest. It was February, a harsh, bright day, and the old woman was in one of her formidable moods. She looked at Henrietta over her needlework and said without preamble, "You still don't know why he sent for you. It's eating you. I can see it. I'm going to break my word to him and tell you a part of it. I'm 80, and I've earned the right to break a word or two before I go, and I think you'll do something foolish out of ignorance. I'd rather you did something foolish out of knowledge, which at least has a chance of being the right kind of foolishness." She put down her needlework. "Do you know how your father was ruined, child? The whole story, or just the part they printed?" "I know he didn't do it," Henrietta said. "Yes, he didn't do it. I know that too." The old woman's mouth was grim. "There was a man, nearly 12 years ago now, who You do it, a clever man. He let your father's hand take the blame. He's dead now. Died in his bed, respected, mourned. A great man of business and charity. The thing he did to your father died respectable with him, and would have stayed buried forever, but for one person who knew the truth and couldn't prove it." She looked at Henrietta steadily. "My nephew knew the truth. He was 22. He was young and open-hearted and certain, in the way of the young, that the truth, once spoken, would be believed. So he stood up. In a room full of the people who mattered, at the height of the scandal, he told it. He named the man who had done it. He said your father was innocent, and he said who was guilty, and he said it with his whole heart in front of everyone who could have saved your father if they had chosen." Henrietta had gone very still. "They laughed at him," said Lady Perseus, her old voice steady and terrible. "That's the thing you must understand if you are to understand him at all. They laughed. A boy of 22, with no proof but his own certainty, accusing a great and powerful man, defending a ruined clerk. They thought it a fine joke. The great man's friends closed around him like water. They painted my nephew a fool, or a naive boy taken in, or worse. They used his very speaking as proof of your father's guilt. For see, they said, the accused has no defenders but a wild boy who will say anything. My nephew's speaking did not save your father, it helped to sink him." The room was very quiet. "That is what Samuel has carried for 10 years, the old woman continued. Not only that he failed, but that he made it worse. He stood up and spoke the truth with his whole heart, and the truth was worth nothing, and his speaking it did harm. A thing like that will cure a man of speaking. It cured him. He has not, from that day, believed that a word of his was worth the breath to say it, so he stopped saying them. He did what a man can do in silence instead, and he waited." "Waited for what?" Henrietta asked, though she thought she knew now. "For proof," said Lady Perseus, "for the thing he lacked at 22. He has spent 10 years quietly, in the only way he trusts, in deeds, not words, gathering what he could not gather then, and he waited for you. He has watched, all this while, for what would become of the daughter. He could not undo what was done to the father. He could not give the father his name back while he lived, and the father is dead. But the daughter was living somewhere, paying for a crime that was not even her own. My nephew has never, for one day, forgotten that he owes that daughter a debt he could not pay in words. When he heard you were in London, refused at every door, he did the first thing a man can do in silence. He opened his own." The old woman picked up her needlework again, her hands not quite steady. "There. Now you know why the fire was lit before you asked. It was not for companionship, it was for a debt. I have broken my word to him, and I do not repent it. You will not tell him I told you, and you will do now whatever the knowing tells you to do." Henrietta sat very still for a long time in the bright, cold room. She understood, now, a great many things. She understood the debt she had seen in his gray eyes that first morning. She understood the fire, and the library, and the care taken that no giving should ever be traced. She understood the silence itself, the whole terrible architecture of it. A man who had spoken the truth once with his whole heart and been made to watch it do harm, and had shut his mouth on the world for 10 years rather than risk such a thing again. And she understood, with a pang that stole her breath, what it meant. Everything he had done for her, every kindness of that whole strange winter, had been done not for her at all. It had been done for a debt to a dead man, out of a guilt 10 years old. The man who had done it had never once expected, or wanted, or perhaps even imagined, that she might come to matter to him for her own sake. And she understood, sitting there, that she had come to want him to. That was the foolishness Lady Perseus had seen. She had fallen somewhere in that silent winter of lit fires and written cards, in love with the Duke of Linwood. He did not know it. He would never guess it. He believed himself only to be paying, in deeds, an old debt to a name. It was a hard thing to know. She was proud, and she had lost everything else, and her pride was the last thing she owned. It gnawed at a proud woman's heart to love a man whose kindness was born solely of guilt over her father's ruin. For a day or two she convinced herself that the only honorable, the only bearable path was to leave, to seize that knowledge and wield it as Lady Perseus had advised. The whisper of that knowledge urged her to depart, to cease accepting charity that was little more than an apology to a ghost, to salvage the last vestiges of her pride, and seek refuge in the industrial towns. Yet she did not go, and the reason she remained was the seismic shift that altered everything. It wasn't weakness, nor was it solely love, though love was certainly present. It was that, in the hushed gray dawn within the library, she had begun to see the man behind the debt, and that man, she realized, was worth far more than the debt itself, and infinitely more than her pride. She could not bear to abandon a man who had retreated into 10 years of silence, wounded by a pain no one had ever attempted to heal, especially when she might be the only soul alive capable of doing so. She had come to Old Croft seeking salvation, but in the end, she stayed, because she began to believe she might be the one offering it. And for a woman who had lost everything, that sense of purpose, of having something unique to give that no one else could, was worth more than any wage or any warm hearth. She had believed that last shred of her worth had perished with her father. Instead, she found it alive, and so she stayed. One night in March, a subtle yet profound change settled between them, though no words were ever exchanged, for words rarely were between them. Lady Perseus caught a severe chill, the kind that unnerves even the stoutest hearts when afflicting the very old. For 2 days, her condition remained critical. The physician's visits were somber. Henrietta sat vigil through the worst of the second night, dabbing the ancient, fevered brow, her hand clasped in the frail one. Then, well past midnight, the door opened without a sound, and the Duke stood there. He didn't need to ask about his aunt's state. He could see it. He drew a chair to the other side of the bed and sat. Together, they kept watch through the small, cold hours, flanking the woman who, in her own way, had brought them together, and would have been aghast to know it. They remained silent. But as dawn approached, the old lady's breathing finally eased, the immediate danger receding. Henrietta looked up, meeting his gaze across the bed. He wasn't looking at his aunt, but at her, his gray eyes holding the hollow ache of a wound and the vast emptiness of winter, with no pretense or artifice to shield him. He didn't look away, and neither did she. The moment stretched, indeterminate, for what felt like an age. Then, Lady Perseus stirred, muttering a gruff, sleepy remark, the surest sign she would recover, and the charged stillness dissolved. But it had happened. They had both been present, and a happening, once it occurs, cannot be unhappened, no matter how long two proud souls refuse to acknowledge it. The trouble, as it invariably does, arrived from the one with the most to lose by the truth. The man who had ruined her father was dead. But he had left a widow, and that widow, Lady Vivian Cranford, was very much alive. In her sphere, she wielded as much influence as the Duke did in his. A handsome woman, still under 50, with a smooth, unlined face and a politely chilling smile. Her graciousness was such that people often didn't realize they'd been subtly cut until the bleeding began. Since her husband's death, her entire life had been built upon the respectability of his name, the fortune of his charitable endeavors, and the immense, warm legacy he'd left behind. She guarded all three with the fierce possessiveness of a lioness protecting her cubs, and for the same primal reason, they constituted her entire world. Perhaps she didn't know the precise details of her husband's dealings with Mr. Wendwood 12 years prior. Or perhaps she did, and had willfully buried the knowledge, as people do with the crimes that afford them comfort. Either way, she grasped this much with the sharp instinct of a woman whose entire standing rested on a foundation of buried secrets. She knew the Wendwood name was a liability, and the Wendwood name, shielded by the Duke of Linwood, was a danger of an entirely different magnitude. For he was the only man who had ever spoken of her husband in the same breath as his own. She moved to neutralize it, with the practiced, almost invisible precision of her kind. She began with the oldest weapon in existence, the daughter's good name. It was devastatingly simple. A young woman, unmarried, living under the roof of an unmarried duke, was a situation that only required the right whispers to do its insidious work. It mattered little that Lady Perseus resided at Old Croft, that every social convention was meticulously observed, that Henrietta was merely the old woman's paid companion and nothing more. Lady Vivian mentioned it. She mentioned it with a gracious sigh, a feigned reluctance. In a dozen drawing rooms, lamenting what a terrible pity it was, such a profound pity, that the Wendwood girl, whatever one thought of her father, should have so carelessly discarded her last shred of reputation, that she should choose to live so scandalously with a man like Linwood, a man of whom one heard such stories. The sigh did the rest. Within a month, the gossip had spread like wildfire. The narrative had shifted from a duke's benevolent charity to a ruined man's daughter, to an outright, undeniable scandal, and it clung to Henrietta with the same suffocating grip as her initial disgrace. It achieved precisely what it was designed to do. It rendered her presence at Old Croft a threat that would ultimately bring down not only herself, but the old woman she served, and the man who had offered her refuge. Henrietta learned of it gradually, as such insidious truths are revealed. A sidelong glance here, an unanswered letter there, a chilling politeness where once there had been warmth. Then, in a single, cruel afternoon, the full impact struck. She had accompanied Lady Perseus to a house in the county, a place the old woman had frequented for 50 years. The door opened. The daughter of the house emerged, her face a mask of pink unease, to declare her mother was not at home. Lady Perseus, nearing 80 and accustomed to unfailing hospitality, sat ramrod straight in the carriage, her silence unbroken until they were well away. Then, in a voice trembling with a fury Henrietta had never witnessed before, she spoke. "So, it has come to this. They will close their doors on me in my old age, all because of a lie, rather than shun Vivian Cranford." A cold resolve settled over Henrietta. Well, we shall see about that. But beneath the outward anger, she heard the raw hurt, and a sickening certainty washed over her. She was the cause. Her presence was destroying the one person who had offered her unreserved kindness. The honorable. The only decent course of action was what she had refused to do a month prior, to leave. That evening she went to the Duke. Throughout the entire winter she had never sought him out to discuss anything of consequence. Now, she did. He was in his study, the door ajar, candles casting a warm glow, his hand moving with practiced, spare precision over a document. He looked up as she entered, and a fleeting expression, quickly suppressed, crossed his usually impassive face. She stood in the doorway, forcing herself to speak. She laid it all out, plainly, for she knew he valued reality, and a simple truth, plainly spoken, was the truest offering she could make him. "You must let me go," she said. "You know what is being said. You know who is saying it. Lady Perseus was refused entry today, at her age, after 50 years, because of me, because I am here. That woman intends to ruin all three of us, and she will, because a lie, spoken with the right voice, cannot be refuted. I will not stay and be the ruin of the two people who—" Her voice faltered. She took a breath. "I know why you brought me here. Lady Perseus told me. I know about my father and what you did, and what it cost you. I know this was never a sanctuary. It was a debt, and you have paid it, Your Grace, 10 times over. I release you from the rest of it. You owe my father nothing further. You owe me nothing at all. Let me go, and let the talk go with me. Keep your aunt her doors, and yourself your peace. It is the only thing left that I can do for any of you, and I am asking you to let me do it." A long silence ensued, unlike any before. She watched him reach for his pen, a habit ingrained over 10 years of writing his replies. Then she watched him regard the pen, and set it down. She understood then that he was wrestling with something, that a profound internal battle raged behind those still, gray eyes. It was the struggle of a man who, for a decade, had met the world with ink. Now, confronted with a reality that ink could not address, he rose. He came around the desk, standing before her, close enough that she had to tilt her head to meet his gaze. She saw in his gray eyes the full extent of the wound Lady Perseus had named, and something more. Something that hadn't been present that first morning, something that had grown throughout the winter in the hushed library, something utterly unrelated to any debt owed to a dead man. And the Duke of Linwood, a man who had uttered no more than a dozen words consecutively in any public setting for 10 years, opened his mouth and spoke. "No," he said. It was a single word. His voice was low, roughened by disuse, and the effort was palpable. It was, Henrietta thought, the most extraordinary thing she had ever heard. A solitary spoken word from a man who had made silence his sole armor, directed at her, in a candle-lit study, meant to keep her. "No," he repeated, his voice steadying, still rough, but firmer. A man relearning a forgotten skill. "You will not go. I let you believe this was a debt because it was easier. A debt is something I know how to pay in silence, and I have paid everything in silence for 10 years. It was a debt once. It is not a debt now. It hasn't been a debt since—" He paused, as if searching for the precise moment. "Since that second morning in this library, when you told me I was wrong about a book, and you were right, and you didn't care that I was a duke. It stopped being a debt then. I didn't tell you. I didn't tell you because I had stopped believing that my words could make something true, or safe, or worth the risk of saying. I let you go on thinking it was a debt. I was a coward to do it. I am done being a coward." He drew a breath. "Vivian Cranford will not ruin you. I will not permit it. And I will not permit it in the one way I have refused to engage for 10 years. Because I have learned this winter, from you, that there is something worse than speaking the truth and having it cause harm. It is remaining silent and letting harm be done, and calling that silence wisdom. I called it wisdom for 10 years. It was fear. You have cured me of it." A subtle movement flickered at the corner of his stern mouth, the faintest ghost of a smile, a hint of something she had never seen. "Now, go to bed, Henrietta. Trust me, and do not speak to me again of going," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "For I find I have found my voice again at a bad moment for anyone who wishes to argue with me, and I intend to use it." She was utterly speechless. She, who had done all the speaking that winter, stood in the doorway of his study, unable to find a single word. "You see," he said, his voice softer, "it's not so easy when it's your turn. Go to bed. I have letters to write. And for the first time in 10 years, I know exactly what I intend to say." The county's Grand Assembly convened that year, as it did every year, in the stately halls of the Assembly House in the county town. Everyone attended, everyone of consequence within a 30-mile radius. This year, they came with ears buzzing, filled with the tale of the Wendwood girl and the silent Duke, and Lady Vivian Cranford arrived, convinced, at the zenith of her power, that she had triumphed. She had every reason to be. The daughter was now doubly disgraced. The elderly aunt had been ostracized, and the Duke, the silent Duke, could no more defend them than he had ever defended anything. Everyone knew he did not speak, that he was incapable of it, that whatever the truth of the matter, he would sit at the edge of the room, as he always did, say nothing, and let the tide sweep the girl away. Lady Vivian had built her entire scheme on the Duke of Linwood's silence, a silence as rare and precious as any in England. She swept into the assembly in her most magnificent attire, greeted like royalty. She allowed herself, as she greeted acquaintances here and there, the slightest, most delicate, sighing mention of poor Lady Perseus, who truly should have known better at her age, and of the Wendwood girl, of whom the less said, the better. She watched her subtle remarks work their magic, and she was content. Henrietta had not wanted to come. The Duke had asked her, not written, asked in his gruff, halting voice. She found she couldn't refuse him anything when he spent his precious, hard-won words on a request. So, she came on Lady Perseus's arm into the long, bright rooms, filled with the very people who had turned her away at every door. She held her back straight. She waited to be shunned, and she was shunned thoroughly, by 100 people at once. The cold shoulders turning, the space opening around her as around something diseased. She bore it. She had borne it before. She fixed her eyes on the far end of the room and bore it. Beside her, Lady Perseus bore it too. Fierce and upright and stiff, the two of them stood in their island of cold space, while the assembly flowed and glittered around them. And across the room, Lady Vivian Cranford smiled her pleasant smile. And then the Duke of Linwood crossed the room. People did not at first understand what they were seeing. They saw the silent Duke, whom they had all half forgotten, was even present, for he had been standing at the edge, as he always stood, rise and cross the long room. They made way for him, as they always made way. They supposed he was leaving, or going for a private word with his aunt. He came to where Henrietta stood, and deliberately took his place beside her in the island of cold space, so that the space now contained a Duke, and its creation suddenly cost something. Then he turned to face the room and did the thing that no one in that county had seen him do in 10 years. He spoke aloud to all of them. "You will forgive me," said the Duke of Linwood, and his voice, rough at first, then steadying, carried down the long room into a silence that fell like a dropped cloth. "If I am clumsy, I am out of the habit of speaking, as you know. You have made a great deal over the years of my silence. You have called it pride and madness, and worse. I will tell you now what it was. I find I have at last a thing worth breaking it for, and a thing worth saying, should be said, where the harm was done." He looked once at Henrietta, then out again at the room. 10 years ago, in rooms very like this one, a man was destroyed for a crime he did not commit. His name was Wendwood. He kept the accounts of the Brightwell Trust for 20 years without an error. A great sum went missing from that trust. It was made to seem his hand had taken it, or he was ruined and he died of it. He did not take it. I knew he did not take it. I knew who did. I was 22. I stood up in a room like this one and I said what I knew. And you laughed at me. Some of you here tonight laughed at me. You called me a green boy and a fool. You used my speaking as another stone to throw at Wendwood. I watched an innocent man go down under the weight of a truth I had made heavier by saying it badly, too young, without proof. And I learned that night the lesson you taught me, that the truth is worth nothing in a room like this, unless it comes with weight behind it. So I said no more. For 10 years I gathered the weight. I did in silence what I could not do in speech, and I have it now. He drew from his coat a packet of papers and held it up, and the room was utterly still. "The man who took the money from the Brightwell Trust," said the Duke, "and let Wendwood's name carry it, was Sir Gerald Cranford. I have the proof of it here, the true account, the banker's record he thought destroyed, the letter in his own hand, to the man he paid to forge Wendwood's. I have had it these 2 years. I did not use it because the man was dead, and I am not in the business of destroying the dead, and the daughter of the man he wronged was quiet and beyond his reach. I judged that to rake it all open would do her more harm than good." His voice hardened. "I was wrong. I have been taught this winter that there is a worse thing than speaking a truth that does harm. It is holding a truth that would do good out of fear, and calling the fear prudence. Sir Gerald Cranford ruined an innocent man, and died respectable for it. I will not let that stand 1 hour longer. Whatever it costs the living, whatever it costs his name, whatever it costs me. Mr. Wendwood was innocent, his daughter is innocent, and the next person in this room who offers her an unkindness will answer for it to me. I find after 10 years that I have got my voice back, and a great deal to say. There is a kind of silence that is worse than any noise, and it fell now on the long, bright rooms. In the middle of it, alone, Lady Vivian Cranford stood with her pleasant smile gone at last from her face. Everyone in the room turned slowly to look at her. She had built her whole life on a dead man's name and a buried thing. The thing was unburied now in a duke's hand before all the people who mattered. There was no gracious sigh that could cover it, and no cold shoulder that could turn it aside. She looked in that moment not like a lioness, but like what she was. A frightened woman who had spent 30 years guarding a grave and had just watched it opened. She did not speak. There was nothing to say. She gathered what was left of her dignity, which was not much, and she went out through the parting crowd alone. The doors of that county closed behind her, one by one, in the weeks that followed, exactly as they had closed on Henrietta. And there was no triumph in it that Henrietta could find, only the old sad justice of a buried thing come up at last into the light. They cleared her father's name that spring in the proper forms, with the proper papers, in a quiet room and not a loud one, for the loud part was done. It took lawyers and time and the weight of a duke behind it. At the end of it, there was a document that said, in the dry language of such documents, that Mr. Wendwood of Hertfordshire had been wrongly accused, and stood acquitted of any wrong, and that his name was restored to him and to his heirs. Henrietta held it in her hands in the library at Old Croft at the grey early hour, with the Duke beside her. She read the dry words that gave her back the thing taken from her 2 years before, and from her father before that. And she wept at last, the weeping she had trained herself out of. The Duke did not write her a card. He did not this once keep his silence. He put his arm around her and let her weep, and said nothing, because nothing needed saying. It was the fullest silence of that whole silent winter. "He did not live to see it," she said when she could speak. "That is the thing. You gave me back his name, and he is not here to have it. He died believing he had failed. that his careful, honest life had come to nothing, that his daughter was left with a poisoned name and no one in the world. He never knew you were gathering the truth. He never knew anyone believed him but me, and I did not count. If he had only known at the end that one man of weight believed him and would not let it rest. He knew, said the Duke. It was the first she learned of it. I went to him before he died. I could not clear him then. I had not the proof. But I went to him, an unknown young man, and I told him that I knew he was innocent, that I believed him, that I would not rest until it was proven, however long it took. I could give him nothing but my word, and I had learned by then that my word was worth little, but I gave it to him. He knew Henrietta. At the end, he knew that one person in the world believed him. It was not enough. It was not his name back nor his life. But he did not die thinking no one believed him. I made sure of that much. It was the last thing I said aloud to anyone for 10 years, until you. I told a dying innocent man that I believed him. Then I shut my mouth on the world. I did not open it again until this winter for you. And Henrietta understood then the whole shape of the thing. The 10 silent years bookended by 2 spoken truths, one to her dying father, one to the room that had wronged him, the long silence between them broken at last by a girl who had come to his door with nothing and given him back his voice. She was restored that spring to everything she had lost and more. Her father's name was cleared. The doors that had shut on her opened again, all of them. Eagerly now, ashamed now. She found she did not much care for them, having learned exactly what they were worth. Lady Perseus had her doors back, and used them to be magnificently rude to everyone who had refused her, which she enjoyed enormously, and the Duke of Linwood had taken in a ruined girl to pay a debt to a dead man. He found himself at the end of that winter, with the debt paid, the wound healed, and his voice returned, and with a thing he had never once, in all his careful silent planning, planned for. He asked her in the library at the gray hour where it had all begun. He did not write it on a card. He had done with cards for her. He said it aloud, still a little rough, for the voice was 10 years out of practice, and would always carry the mark of those years. She thought she would not have had it any other way. The roughness was the proof of what the speaking cost him, and therefore, of what she was worth to him. I have given you back everything that was taken from you, he said. Your name, your father's name, your place in the world, such as it is worth, which is little. You are free now, Henrietta. You need nothing from me. You have a name to be proud of, and doors that will open, and no debt to any living soul. I made certain of that first, before I let myself ask you this. I would not have you take me out of need or gratitude, or because you had nowhere else to be. You have somewhere else to be now. You have the whole world back, so I can ask you cleanly, which I could not have done in the winter. He paused, and she saw the cost of it. The man who had spent his words so carefully for 10 years, spending the most careful ones of all. I have been alone in my own silence for 10 years. I did not know it was loneliness until you filled it. Stay not as my aunt's companion, not as a debt I am paying, not because you must. Stay because you would. Marry me, Henrietta, and make me talk. For I find I can only bear to do it for you, and I have 10 years of things saved up to say. And Henrietta Wendwood, who had come to Oldcroft with everything she owned in one small valise, and no future at all, stood in the library, where a silent man had first written her a kindness he could not speak. She made the choice that was wholly her own now, freely, out of no need and no fear, wanting nothing she did not already have, choosing only because she chose. I kept your cards, she said, all of them. Every one you ever wrote me in the drawer of my dressing table this whole winter, before I understood why. I think I understood before I understood, if you take my meaning. She reached up and touched his hard face, the first time she had ever touched him. Yes, Samuel, I will marry you. I will make you talk. Though I warn you, I have grown fond of the silences too, and I will want some of those kept. She was quiet a moment. You gave me back my name, but you gave me a better thing first, before ever the name. You did it that first night, without a word. When you had a fire lit in a cold room for a stranger, you owed nothing. You gave me back the belief that a kindness could be only a kindness. I had lost that. It was the most profound loss I endured, eclipsing even the forfeiture of my name. And it was you who restored it to me, not with grand pronouncements, but with a flickering flame and 3 simple lines on a card, before you truly knew me, before it could evolve into anything more than what it was. That is the man I am marrying, Not the Duke who finally broke his silence in a resplendent hall, though I cherish him too, the one who ignited that spark. They were wed at Old Croft in the early summer, a quiet affair, for neither relished ostentation. Lady Perseus graced the front pew, exuding an air of having orchestrated the entire event, a claim she steadfastly maintained throughout her considerable years. The societal doors that had once closed upon the bride were now flung wide open, and their proprietors returned, offering their forgiveness, more or less. Henrietta wore no borrowed silks, only a simple, elegant gown, and carried her father's redeemed name up the aisle, like a long-lost treasure finally returned home. There existed a ritual they observed in the ensuing years of contentment, a practice incomprehensible to those unfamiliar with their shared history. Each morning, in the dim light of dawn, the Duke and Duchess of Linwood would retreat to the library. They would sit together as the light gradually filled the room, and for a time, not a word would pass between them. This was not the old silence, the defensive barrier of years gone by. It was a different kind, a profound one, the silence of two souls who had spoken their all, needing no further utterance, having discovered a language richer than words, a listening that sought no reply. He found his voice again in those good years. He used it wisely, sparingly, still carrying a touch of its former roughness. The very county that had once deemed his silence a form of madness now treasured his rare, dry pronouncements more than the ceaseless chatter of others. Such is the way of the world, cherishing a possession most when it has learned the sting of its potential loss. Yet, in the twilight hours, with her, he often remained silent, and she in turn with him. It was in this shared quietude that they were most completely themselves, most at home. He learned to speak anew, slowly, and she met his hesitant progress with unwavering patience. She understood the cost of losing that ability, and the greater cost of reclaiming it. It began with a single word where a card had once sufficed, then a sentence, and eventually, on a warm evening by the hearth, a complete recollection of his boyhood, a story she had never dared to imagine hearing. He was never a man of many words, and never would be, but he became a man capable of articulating the essential, the deeply felt, to the one who mattered, when it truly mattered. That was all she had ever desired of him, and in truth, more than the world had ever anticipated from him. Years later, he rose in the house and spoke briefly, in his characteristic concise and rugged manner, on the subject of a poor law. Men who had known him only as the reticent Duke leaned forward, captivated. His words carried weight and brought about positive change. Upon his return home, he recounted the experience to her, almost as if confessing a minor transgression. She chuckled, her pride in him far exceeding what she allowed him to see. She thought of the young man of 22, who had once believed truth, once spoken, would inevitably be heard. A young man who had been forced to abandon that belief, only to have it rekindled, at long last, in a somber room in Kent, by a woman who had arrived at his door with nothing. She kept those cards until the end of her days, a winter's worth of them, the neat, upright script on the unadorned cards, the conversation begun, half-spoken, of the season she had arrived with nothing and found, in lieu of wages, a life. And on the library wall, nestled amongst the books, she framed the very first thing he had ever written her, the 3 lines and the solitary initial, L. The wordless kindness of a silent man towards a stranger, to whom he owed nothing, who had offered refuge from the biting cold on the bleakest night of her life. No one who hadn't known their story could ever comprehend why a duchess would preserve and honor such a humble scrap of card. But Henrietta knew. Every respectable establishment in London had turned her away, one after another, during the harshest winter of her life, and rightly so, by their limited standards. And one man, who never spoke, had said nothing at all and simply opened his door. It was, in the end, the entirety of her happiness, and it had begun without a single spoken word.